Hi everyone, this is Rick, and today I'll be interviewing Sarah Schlafly. Sarah is the co-founder and CEO of Mighty Cricket, an agricultural tech startup with a mission to build clean food supply in order to sustain the world's exponentially growing population. One way that they're doing that is, as their name suggests, taking an overlooked food source like crickets and turning them into delicious snacks and meals like these. Currently, Mighty Cricket sells protein powder as well as oatmeal. I recently tried the dark chocolate protein oatmeal, and it was surprisingly good. At first I was expecting maybe a weird smell or taste, but it tastes just like a rich dark chocolate oatmeal. It was a little bit sweet for me, but I can definitely see people, especially kids, liking this kind of flavor. So let us find out how Sarah built her company. Hey Sarah, to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as well as your company, Mighty Cricket?
Sure. So I'm Sarah Schlafly, the founder of Mighty Cricket, and our mission is to build a clean protein supply to sustain the world. Very lofty goal right here. But Mighty Cricket is working on next generation proteins, and we take these proteins that are incredibly nutritious and sustainable, and we turn them into absolutely delicious dishes that Americans will crave. So, for example, one of our leading protein sources comes from cricket protein. So cricket, the insect, not very appetizing for the American palate, but we take the crickets, we lightly roast them until they're this delicious, nutty pistachio flavor. And then we mill them into a really fine powder so that we can seamlessly blend them undetected into a delicious bowl of chocolate oatmeal.
Wow. That's awesome. And so this is a question that I always ask, but I'm especially curious this time. So how did you come up with the idea for doing this?
Well, my background is in nutrition cooking, and I'm very passionate about food equity, getting nutritious foods to those who need it the most. And when I taught cooking classes for lower income families, I would work in public housing authorities would hire me to come in and teach for their residents. And I discovered that clean protein is one of the hardest food groups to find in grocery stores at an affordable price. And this is because grass-fed chicken, free-range chicken, grass-fed beef requires so many resources. And then even plant-based protein sources, like the organic protein sources, are very expensive. And so I'm also really interested in international cuisine, and I learned that 2 billion people across 80% of the world's countries eat insects as a protein source. I was like, wow, this is such an untapped protein source here in the US. And when I did more research, I discovered that they can be prepared in a really delicious manner. They are incredibly nutritious, but they also require so few inputs compared to conventional protein, both plants and conventional meats, that if I can get this protein source to go mainstream, I can scale the industry and really drive down the cost so that our next generation has access to clean protein in a way that today we don't even have access to because it is so expensive.
Mm-hmm. And so what was kind of the first step that you took after having that idea? How do you find your crickets?
Yeah. So the first step was to try some cricket products on the market. I scoured the internet and found some, and I tried it. My impression was, okay, this tastes, it tastes fine. It doesn't taste like anything buggy, but the flavor profile and the textures can definitely be improved upon. And putting on my former culinary hat, I started sourcing some powder directly from cricket farms. And then I worked on just recipe innovation, right? So sticking in all sorts of different things, trying to figure out which products I want to make. And I had a list of products, and then I looked at the amount of resources it would take to manufacture these products versus how much I wanted to invest in the company right off the bat, because this is a pretty wild idea. I didn't know if the US was ready for this or not. And so I came up with our oatmeals because we can make those in really small batches starting off. And it's a really great just like test the market product because it doesn't require too much capital investment. So I started making up some oatmeals and like sampling it around. And after about a year of doing this, I felt pretty confident that with the right language, I can really convince people to try it. And not only try it, but actually fall in love with the product. So after that initial year of testing, then I decided, okay, it's time to invest more into packaging so that I can really actually sell this thing on retail shelves. And so I found an amazingly talented graphic designer, and we started working on different packaging concepts. And we came across one that we think is pretty good. In big, bold letters, we have clean protein on it. And that opens up the question to what is clean protein? And then now we're in the process of doing some more marketing tests, A/B tests online. So figuring out like which messaging responds best in paid advertising. And then from that, we're going to take that data and translate it back into the packaging and continue to improve our packaging.
That's awesome. And so what would you say was the most challenging moment for you so far in starting your business?
Most challenging moment is probably figuring out it's the scaling. So right now I'm working on some pretty big POs from GNC Mexico and some overseas buyers. It's figuring out when is the right time to then switch to, say, getting the product co-packed and balancing our cash flows and meeting MOQs, minimum order quantities, from our packaging designers that we want to work with, not the designers, the printers that we want to work with, and all of that, all the logistics and the very fine-tuned pieces, that's probably the most challenging.
Mm-hmm. And kind of on the flip side, what would you say was the best or most satisfying moment for you?
I would say every time we launch a new product and got it on the market, it's very satisfying. So this year we launched our chocolate and vanilla protein powders. And this took several months of experimentation and then several more months of packaging iterations. And finally I got launched. And it felt great because a lot of customers are looking exactly for just a cleaner protein powder. And then I think our oatmeals really complement that, because those who aren't really into protein powder supplements, but they just want real food, really appreciate that we have these instant breakfast options available that they can enjoy.
That's awesome. And so you kind of mentioned this, but where would you say you are right now along your startup journey? Are you still constantly worried about the survival of your company?
I built this company with the idea that it was a long-term play. I wanted to get in early on the market and start testing and iterating on a very low budget before the market really took off. And in doing that, I thought that by the time the market does really start to ramp up, I'll have my pieces in place so that I can play with the bigger brands in this space. Whereas if I waited, then, I would be at a disadvantage because I don't have as much money to invest in it. So where I am is, I'd say that we are still very much testing messaging and figuring out what is the right term for Cricut, what's the right phrase that we want to use that's really going to inspire the US to embrace this product. So yeah, I would say we're still very much in our bootstrapped early stage, but I am looking at this I've built the company to be as lean as possible so I can have a really long runway. I'm envisioning this company as if it'll be around in 100 years. So I make my financial decisions and I make other decisions based on that philosophy.
And do you have a role model? If so, what have you learned from them that you apply to your business?
Well, I got that 100 years idea from the founder of Patagonia. I think Chenard, I think is the proper pronunciation for his name. So I was listening to the podcast, How I Built This, and I love that podcast because as I'm, manufacturing and just like grinding through, I listen to all these other founders who did the exact same thing. It's really inspiring. And so, yeah, he talked about looking at your company as if it's going to be around in 100 years. And when you do that, then you just make decisions differently and you don't burn yourself out. It's not like, investors and venture capitalists and angels, they all want to see entrepreneurs who are just like toiling away 80 hours a week, always thinking about the company, just like growing super rapidly. And I don't subscribe to that philosophy. It's great for getting a return on your investment, but for like really building a sound company that doesn't burn yourself out in the process, I'm taking more of a organic, natural, holistic approach, which is very much my brand too. So focusing on like growing this business sustainably and in a way that's healthy.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned How I Built This. Do you have any other podcasts or book recommendations?
I really like TED Radio Hour. I find that one really fascinating. It's a compilation of just several TED Talks that they mash up into one episode. And so they take the highlights of the TED Talks, which TED Talks themselves are really great. So it's a fantastic podcast. So those are my top two.
Mm-hmm. And so do you have any advice for someone like me who is still a student, but I'm interested in entrepreneurship and might want to start something on my own in the future?
One thing that I wish I had done was work within a startup that was already somewhat established or like got funding initially, or had done Venture for America or something that was a little bit more training on working with a team. Because when I started my first company, I was 21, I think. And that's where I learned like Startup 101. But it would have been a lot more enjoyable of an experience if I was learning those skills while getting paid, while being on a team. And I think maybe the journey wouldn't have been so lonely at that time. So yeah, I would say don't rush to starting your own business unless you have like a very clear idea and a passion for what it is that you want to do. And I did. I mean, I really wanted to teach nutrition cooking classes and really help. Well, really, my passion was helping the obesity levels in the U.S. And that's kind of where all my ideas sprang from. And then also it's like perfectly fine to do it as a side hustle. If you have the time, you're still an entrepreneur. I had this idea that like I wasn't a true entrepreneur unless I went all in. And on Shark Tank, you hear the sharks talking about, they reward people for going all in and putting all of their life savings in. And I don't subscribe to that idea either. I think that it's very risky to do that. There's a high risk that it's not going to be paid off, and then you're going to get yourself in financial debt. So, I don't with my spirit, I go all in, but that doesn't mean I'm putting all of my life savings on the line for my companies and my startups.
Gotcha. And so I also collected some questions from my audience. And the first one is, where do you get your crickets from? I think you mentioned cricket farm, but like exactly where do you, reach out? How do you find them?
Yeah. So, I'm very well networked in the edible insects industry now. So I know pretty much most of the cricket farms that are doing it for commercial purposes. There are only a handful in the U.S., and I'm waiting for the U.S.-based ones to really automate their operations and develop mature their operations. So the most mature cricket farms are in Thailand. That's really the epicenter of the edible insects industry. So most of my crickets right now that have sourced have come from Thailand and Vietnam, and we ship cargo, which helps reduce the carbon emissions. And then I'm really excited for some of the innovations that the US-based ones are doing right now, because as soon as they start to automate these processes, that's going to really drive down the cost of US-based crickets, and then I can source domestically.
Mm-hmm. And also you mentioned that you kind of lightly roast the crickets, but are there any other processes that you have to do before, how do you turn them from like crickets into your powder form?
Right. So the crickets are cleaned by being blanched in hot water. And then they're dried out and roasted. And that's pretty much it in terms of getting them to be where they need to be in terms of, safe for human consumption. I would say before they're harvested, they are what's called gut loaded. So they go through this fasting cycle, which clears their digestive tract. And they're harvested by being frozen, which mimics their natural life cycle. So they go into this state of torpor, which is kind of like a hibernative state when they're chilled. And then they perish in that state. And that's what happens in the wild in the fall when it gets cold out. About the first frost is when all the crickets kind of shut down and die, and then their eggs carry on till the spring.
That's super interesting. And so before we end, I also have some rapid fire questions. So the first one is, if you could have a superpower, what would it be?
I would love to see in the future, right?
Mm-hmm. And what time do you usually wake up every morning?
Ooh, I wake up kind of on the late side, 7 a.m.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty early for a lot of people still.
Well, maybe for college students, but a lot of working parents wake up at like 5 or 6 a.m.
Mm-hmm. What is something that you do to relieve your stress?
Hiking, definitely. So I go on this hike. I just moved into a new house in the middle of the woods. And I can go on a nice long hike right out my back door and then go down to this drop-off point. And it's a huge cliff. And you can just look over the valley. It's very inspiring.
That's awesome. And if you could have dinner with anyone, who would you choose?
Oh, probably one of the enlightened beings that came on the earth. So like the Buddha or Jesus or any of those figures that sparked a global revolution. Because that's what I'm trying to do, is spark a global revolution. So I could pick their brains on how they did it.
That's awesome. And this is the last question. What is the best advice you've ever received?
Probably if you're waiting for happiness to come in the future, it's probably not going to come. So basically embrace today and be happy with where you're at and where you're going, but don't be so discontent that you're always just looking towards where you're going. Because in doing that, you miss out on the journey. And once you get there, you're going to just look out ahead at where you want to go still. So I'm always climbing up, but I'm very happy in the process and embracing like the today when I haven't yet made it.
That's awesome. Well, that's it for today's interview. Thank you, Sarah, for taking the time to do this. And I wish you and Mighty Cricket the best of luck.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
I hope you liked this episode. If you want to see the latest previews, highlights, and takeaways from each interview, check out our Instagram. You can also listen to our podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. All the links will be in the description below. Finally, leave a comment if there's a particular industry, founder, or question you would like to see asked in our interviews. With that, make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you next time.